The rain hammered against the windshield of the yellow taxicab as David pulled up to another red light. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 9:47 p.m. His shift had officially ended an hour ago, but he needed every dollar he could get. The rent was due in 3 days, and his mom's medicine wasn't getting any cheaper. David had been driving this same route through downtown for 6 months now. After dropping out of college when his father passed away, he took the first job he could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most nights he'd see the same types of people: businessmen heading home late, college kids going to parties, tourists trying to find their hotels. Tonight felt different, though. The streets were quieter because of the storm. As he waited for the light to turn green, something caught his eye. Across the street at the old bus stop that nobody used anymore, sat a young woman. Even through the rain and darkness, he could see she was in trouble. Her whole body was shaking, and not just from the cold. She was crying, the kind of crying that comes from deep inside, the kind that makes your whole chest hurt. David had learned early in this job to mind his own business. His supervisor had warned him about picking up people who looked distressed. "You never know what kind of trouble they might bring," the older driver had said. But something about this girl made him forget all those warnings. She couldn't have been more than 25, wearing what looked like an expensive black dress that was now completely soaked. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and she clutched a small purse like it was the only thing keeping her together. The bus stop didn't even have a roof, so she was getting drenched. The light turned green, but instead of driving forward, David pulled over to the curb. He rolled down his passenger window and called out over the sound of the rain. "Hey, you okay over there?" The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and her makeup had streaked down her cheeks. For a moment, she just stared at him like she couldn't believe someone had actually stopped. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" David asked, turning down his radio. "It's really coming down out here." She hesitated, looking around as if she was trying to figure out where she even was. Then she stood up slowly and walked toward his cab. When she opened the back door, David could see her hands were shaking. "Thank you," she whispered as she slid into the seat. Her voice was barely audible over the rain on the roof. "Where do you need to go?" David asked gently, adjusting his rear-view mirror so he could see her better. She gave him an address that made his eyebrows go up. Riverside Heights, the fancy part of town where houses cost more than most people made in 10 years. That was at least a 30-minute drive from here, maybe 40 in this weather. The fare would be around $60. As they pulled away from the curb, David couldn't help but glance back at his passenger. She had pressed herself into the corner of the seat and was staring out the window at the blurry city lights. Every few seconds, her shoulders would shake with a sob she was trying to hold back. David had always been a talker, but something told him this wasn't the time for small talk. Instead, he just drove, taking the route that would keep them away from the busiest streets. The last thing this girl needed was to be stuck in traffic. About 10 minutes into the ride, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. "I know I must look terrible." "Don't worry about it," David replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "We all have bad days." "Bad day," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "I guess you could call it that." David could hear her taking deep breaths, trying to calm herself down. In his experience, people who got in his cab late at night usually wanted to talk. Sometimes they were drunk and overshared about their problems. Sometimes they were lonely and just needed someone to listen. This felt different. "Can I ask what happened?" he said carefully. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." There was a long pause. David was starting to think she wouldn't respond when she finally spoke. "I found my fiancé with my best friend today," she said quietly. "In our bed. In the apartment we were supposed to move into together next month." David felt his stomach drop. He'd been cheated on before, but he couldn't imagine walking in on something like that. "I'm really sorry," he said. "That's awful." 3 years, she continued, her voice getting stronger. 3 years I've been with him. We were supposed to pick out wedding flowers tomorrow. The wedding is in 2 months. Was in 2 months? She started crying again, but this time it was different. Instead of the quiet, defeated sobs from before, this was angry crying. "The kind that comes when the shock wears off and reality hits. I just ran," she said between tears. "I didn't even take my car keys. I just grabbed my purse and ran. I've been walking around for hours. I didn't know where else to go." David pulled up to another red light and turned around to look at her properly for the first time. Even with her makeup ruined and her hair a mess, he could see she was beautiful. But more than that, there was something real about her pain that made his heart ache. That took courage, he said. Walking away like that, did it? She asked, wiping her nose with a tissue from her purse. Because I feel like a coward. I should have stayed and fought. I should have demanded answers. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is remove yourself from a bad situation, David said. Sounds like you saved yourself from hearing a bunch of lies. She looked at him in the mirror, and for the first time since she'd gotten in the cab, she almost smiled. You're very kind, she said. Most people would just want me to stop crying and get out of their car. Well, I'm not most people, David said as the light turned green. They drove in comfortable silence for a while after that. David found himself taking the longer route without really thinking about it. He told himself it was because of the weather, but deep down he knew he wasn't ready for this ride to end. There was something about this woman that made him want to help her, to make sure she was really okay. As they got closer to Riverside Heights, the houses got bigger and the streets got wider. David had only been to this neighborhood a few times, usually to pick up wealthy businessmen who needed rides to the airport. The houses here had gates and long driveways and gardens that probably cost more to maintain than he made in a year. When they finally pulled up to the address she'd given him, David couldn't believe what he was seeing. It wasn't just a house, it was practically a mansion. Iron gates at least 10 feet tall surrounded the property, and through them he could see a house that looked like something from a movie. The woman in his back seat was looking at the house too, but she didn't seem happy to be there. Home sweet home, she said with no joy in her voice whatsoever. David stared at the massive house through his rain-streaked windshield. The place looked like something out of a magazine, all white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges even in the middle of a thunderstorm. Security lights lit up the circular driveway, and he could see expensive cars parked under a covered area near the garage. "This is your house?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. The woman in the back seat let out a long sigh. "It's my parents' house. I haven't lived here in 4 years, but—" She trailed off, looking defeated again. I didn't know where else to go. David turned around to face her. "What's your name?" "I mean, if you don't mind me asking." "Rachel," she said quietly, "and thank you for not asking earlier. I wasn't really in the mood for small talk." "I'm David," he said. "And I get it. Sometimes you just need to sit with your thoughts." Rachel wiped her eyes with another tissue. The crying had stopped, but she still looked completely drained. "David, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Have you ever had your whole life planned out and then in one day, one moment, it all just falls apart?" David thought about his own life, dropping out of college when his dad died, taking this job instead of finishing his degree, watching his mom struggle with her medical bills while he worked double shifts just to keep their heads above water. "Yeah," he said simply. "I have. What did you do?" "I kept going," David said. "What else can you do? You put one foot in front of the other and figure it out as you go." Rachel looked at him like he'd said something profound, even though it was just the truth. "You make it sound so simple." "Simple doesn't mean easy," David said. "Trust me, I know the difference." For the first time since she'd gotten in his cab, Rachel really looked at him. Not just a glance in the mirror, but actually looked. She saw a guy probably around her age, maybe a little older. His clothes were clean but worn, and there was something in his eyes that said he'd been through his own share of hard times. "Can I tell you the whole story?" she asked suddenly. "I know you're probably tired and want to get home, but I need to tell someone who doesn't know me, someone who won't judge me." David looked at the meter. It had been running for almost 40 minutes now, and the fare was already up to $58. Any other night he would have been worried about the cost for his passenger. But something about Rachel made him forget about the money. "I've got time," he said, turning off the engine. Rachel took a deep breath and started talking. The whole story came pouring out. How she'd met her fiancé in college, how they'd been together for 3 years, how she'd thought he was the one. She told David about the apartment they'd rented together, the wedding they'd been planning, the life they'd mapped out. "His name is Jake," she said, her voice getting stronger as she talked. "I thought I knew him better than anyone. We talked about everything, kids, careers, where we wanted to live when we got older. I trusted him completely." "And your friend?" David asked. "Lindsay, my maid of honor." Rachel laughed bitterly. "I introduced them at my birthday party last year. I was so happy that my fiancé and my best friend got along so well. God, I'm so stupid. You're not stupid, David said firmly. You trusted people you loved. That's not stupid, that's human. But there had to be signs, right? Things I missed? David had been cheated on before by his college girlfriend. He remembered going through the same mental gymnastics trying to figure out what he'd done wrong or what he should have seen coming. Maybe there were signs, maybe there weren't, he said. But even if there were, that doesn't make it your fault. They made choices. Bad choices. Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd said. You sound like you know what you're talking about. My girlfriend in college, David explained. Found out she'd been seeing my roommate for 3 months. They're married now, actually. Ouch. Yeah, it sucked at the time. But looking back, I dodged a bullet. If someone can do that to you, they're not the right person anyway. Rachel nodded slowly. I keep thinking about all the time I wasted. 3 years of my life. It wasn't wasted if you learned something from it, David said. And besides, you're what, 24? 25? You've got plenty of time to find someone who deserves you. 26, Rachel said. And I was so sure he was the one. We had everything planned. The wedding venue, the honeymoon, even names for our future kids. Plans change, David said gently. Doesn't mean your life is over. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain on the roof of the cab. David found himself not wanting this conversation to end. There was something about Rachel that was different from other passengers he'd picked up. She wasn't just making small talk or treating him like hired help. She was talking to him like a real person. David, Rachel said eventually, can I ask what you do when you're not driving a cab? I mean, is this your career or… David hesitated. Most people in this neighborhood would look down on someone who drove a taxi for a living. But Rachel didn't seem like most people. I'm saving up to go back to school, he said. I want to be a teacher. Elementary kids, probably. I had to drop out when my dad died because my mom needed help with the bills. That's really noble, Rachel said. And she sounded like she meant it. It's not noble. It's just what you do for family. Not everyone would do that, Rachel said quietly. Jake certainly wouldn't have. When his dad had a heart attack last year, he complained about having to visit him in the hospital because it interfered with his golf schedule. David cringed. Seriously? Seriously. I should have seen that as a red flag, shouldn't I? Probably, David said honestly. But people show you who they are in their own time. Sometimes it just takes a while to see it clearly. Rachel reached into her purse to get her wallet, and David saw her face change completely. She started frantically digging through the small bag, dumping its contents onto the seat beside her. No, 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 she whispered, her voice rising with panic. What's wrong? My wallet, she said, looking up at him with wide eyes. It's gone. It must have fallen out when I was running. Or maybe I left it at the apartment. I don't have any money. David looked at the meter again. $62. For him, that was groceries for a week or a tank of gas. But looking at Rachel's face, the pure mortification and panic, he made a decision that surprised even him. Don't worry about it, he said, reaching over to turn off the meter. What? No, I can't let you do that. This is how you make your living. It's okay, David said. Really? No, it's not okay. Let me go inside and get money from my parents. They'll pay you, plus extra for waiting. David shook his head. Rachel, it's fine. Sometimes people need help. Today you needed help. She stared at him like he'd just told her he was from another planet. You don't even know me. I know enough, David said. I know you're going through the worst day of your life. And I know you're a good person who just needed someone to listen. Tears started forming in Rachel's eyes again. But these were different from the angry, hurt tears from before. These looked almost like relief. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You don't need to thank me. Just take care of yourself, okay? Rachel gathered her things and opened the car door. Before getting out, she turned back to him. David, I know this might sound weird, but you probably saved my life tonight. Not literally, but you reminded me that there are still good people in the world. As she walked toward the huge front door of the mansion, David sat in his cab watching until she was safely inside. He had no idea that in 3 days his whole world was about to change. 3 days had passed since that rainy night, and David couldn't stop thinking about Rachel. He found himself wondering if she was okay, if she'd confronted her ex-fiancé, if she was staying with her parents or had found somewhere else to go. It was strange how someone could walk into your life for just 1 hour and leave such an impact. Tuesday afternoon found David back in the same area where he'd picked up Rachel, but this time for a completely different reason. He'd gotten a call to pick up a businessman from one of those fancy office buildings in Riverside Heights. The guy was paying extra for David to wait while he finished a meeting, then drive him to the airport. David was parked outside the glass tower, scrolling through his phone and trying not to think about how much gas he was wasting with the air conditioning running, when something caught his eye. A long black limousine was pulling up to the curb right next to his taxi. The limo was the kind you see in movies. Sleek, shiny, and probably worth more than David would make in 5 years. He watched as the driver, dressed in a proper uniform and cap, got out and walked around to open the back door. David was expecting to see some important businessman, or maybe a celebrity, step out. Instead, he nearly choked on his coffee when he saw Rachel emerge from the limousine. But this wasn't the Rachel he'd met 3 nights ago. This version of Rachel looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a magazine. Her hair was styled in perfect waves. She wore a cream-colored business suit that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. And she had on jewelry that caught the sunlight every time she moved. For a moment, David just stared. If he hadn't spent an hour talking to her in his cab, he would never have recognized her. She looked like she belonged in that limousine, like she was born to live in this world of expensive cars and designer clothes. Rachel was walking toward the office building when she happened to glance over and see the yellow taxi parked nearby. Her steps slowed, and David watched as her eyes moved from the cab to him sitting in the driver's seat. The recognition hit her face like a lightning bolt. She stopped walking completely and just stood there for a moment, looking as shocked as David felt. Then, to his surprise, she turned and said something to her driver. The man nodded and got back in the limo, but instead of driving away, he just parked it and waited. Rachel walked over to David's cab, her heels clicking on the pavement. When she reached his window, she bent down slightly, and David could see she looked embarrassed. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi yourself," David replied, rolling down his window. "You look different." Rachel laughed, but it sounded nervous. "I guess I should explain." "You don't owe me any explanations," David said, though he was definitely curious. "Actually, I do," Rachel said. She looked around at the busy street, then back at him. "This is really awkward, but can we talk? Not here, but somewhere else?" David checked his phone. His passenger had texted that the meeting was running late, and he'd need another 30 minutes. "I've got some time," he said. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks down that way," Rachel said, pointing. "It's nothing fancy, just a regular place. Could you meet me there in 10 minutes? David found himself nodding before he even thought about it. "Sure. Let me just text my passenger and let him know I'll be a few minutes late getting back." "Thank you," Rachel said, and she looked genuinely relieved. The coffee shop was exactly what Rachel had promised, nothing fancy. It was the kind of place where working people grabbed coffee on their way to the office, with mismatched chairs and a menu written on a chalkboard. David got there first and ordered a regular coffee, black. When Rachel walked in 5 minutes later, she looked completely out of place in her expensive suit. She ordered a simple coffee too, and sat down across from him at a small table by the window. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "So," David said finally, "limousines, huh?" Rachel's face turned red. "David, I'm sorry. I should have been honest with you the other night." "About what?" "About who I am." Rachel took a deep breath. "My full name is Rachel Hartwell. My father is Robert Hartwell." The name sounded familiar to David, but he couldn't place it. "He owns Hartwell Tech," Rachel continued. "You know, the company that makes those apps everyone uses for food delivery and ride-sharing?" Now David knew exactly who she was talking about. Robert Hartwell was one of those billionaire tech guys who was always in the news. His company had basically changed how people got around in cities. "Oh," David said, feeling a little stupid. "Wow." "I know what you're thinking," Rachel said quickly. "You're thinking I lied to you, did you?" "Not exactly," Rachel said. "Everything I told you about Jake and Lindsay was true. Everything about the wedding being ruined, all of that was real. I didn't tell you about my family." David took a sip of his coffee, trying to process this information. "So that mansion, my parents' house, yes. I haven't lived there in 4 years, though. I moved out after college because I wanted to make it on my own." "Make it on your own how?" David asked. He wasn't being mean, just curious. "I work as a social worker," Rachel said, "downtown at the community center. I have my own apartment, well, had my own apartment. It's the one I shared with Jake." "A social worker?" David couldn't hide his surprise. I know it sounds crazy coming from someone whose dad is worth $2 billion, Rachel said, but I wanted to do something that mattered. I wanted to help people who actually needed help. David found himself smiling. That's actually pretty cool. You're not mad that I didn't tell you? Why would I be mad? David asked. You don't owe me your life story. Besides, you were having the worst night of your life. I don't think discussing your trust fund was high on your priority list. Rachel laughed, and this time it sounded genuine. Trust fund. God, you make me sound so spoiled. Are you spoiled? Rachel thought about it seriously. I was growing up. Everything I wanted I got. The best schools, the best clothes, trips to Europe every summer. But when I got to college and saw how most people actually lived, it changed me. I realized I'd never really earned anything in my life. So you became a social worker. So I became a social worker, Rachel confirmed. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. They kept waiting for me to come home and asked to work at the company. Instead, I moved into a tiny apartment and started helping kids whose parents couldn't afford school supplies. David was quiet for a moment, studying Rachel's face. She looked nervous, like she was waiting for him to judge her or be angry with her. What happened after I dropped you off? He asked instead. My parents were shocked to see me, Rachel said. I told them everything. My dad wanted to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on Jake, and my mom wanted to sue him for emotional distress. Did you let them? No, Rachel said firmly. I told them I just needed time to figure things out. I've been staying at the house for 3 days trying to decide what to do next. And the limousine? Rachel looked embarrassed again. My father insisted. He said I shouldn't be driving while I'm upset. Plus, he had this business meeting today that he wanted me to sit in on. He's been trying to convince me to join the company for years. Are you going to? I don't know, Rachel said honestly. 3 days ago, I thought I had my whole life figured out. Now I don't know anything. David reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Before I forget, he said, sliding it across the table to her. Rachel opened it and found $62 in cash. David, what is this? The cab fare from the other night, plus tip. I told you not to worry about it. And I told you that sometimes people need help, Rachel said. But you've helped me enough. This is me paying you back. David wanted to argue, but he could see from Rachel's expression that this was important to her. He took the money and put it in his wallet. Thank you, he said. Thank you for giving me a chance to make it right, Rachel replied. They sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. David told her more about his mom's medical bills and his dream of becoming a teacher. Rachel told him about her work at the community center and how different her life was from what people expected. When it was time for David to get back to his passenger, Rachel walked him to the door of the coffee shop. David, she said, stopping him before he could leave. I know this might be weird given everything, but would you like to have dinner sometime? As friends, she added quickly. I mean, I know we're from completely different worlds, but I'd like that, David said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Rachel smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Really? Really. But next time you pick the place, somewhere you actually want to go, not somewhere you think you should go. As David walked back to his cab, he realized that Rachel Hartwell might come from a world of limousines and billion-dollar companies. But the woman he'd met on that rainy night was still in there, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. David stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his tiny apartment, wondering for the 10th time if he was making a huge mistake. Rachel had called him 2 days after their coffee shop meeting, and they'd been texting back and forth ever since. Tonight was their first real date, and he had no idea what to expect. She'd insisted on picking a place just like he'd suggested. When she texted him the address, he'd looked it up online and been relieved to see it was just a regular restaurant downtown, not one of those fancy places where you needed a reservation 3 months in advance and the menu didn't have prices. David pulled on his best shirt, which wasn't saying much. It was clean and didn't have any holes, but it was the same shirt he'd worn to his job interview 6 months ago. He checked his wallet, $43. Enough for dinner if they kept it simple, but he'd be eating ramen for the rest of the week. The restaurant was called Tony's, and it was the kind of family-owned Italian place that had been around for 30 years. Red checkered tablecloths, pictures of Italy on the walls, and the smell of garlic bread filling the air. David got there first and waited at a table near the window, checking his phone every few seconds. When Rachel walked in, David barely recognized her again. But this time, it was different from the business suit version he'd seen outside the office building. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was down and natural, and she looked nervous, just like he felt. "Hi," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You look nice," David said, and meant it. This version of Rachel seemed more real somehow, more like the person he'd met in his cab. "Thanks. I wasn't sure what to wear." Rachel picked up the menu and smiled. "This place is perfect, by the way. I found it online. It has great reviews and the prices are reasonable." David appreciated that she'd thought about the prices, but it also made him feel a little embarrassed. Here was someone whose family could probably buy this entire restaurant without thinking twice, and she was worried about keeping things affordable for him. "So how are you doing?" David asked. "I mean, really doing. It's been almost a week since everything happened." Rachel sighed. "Some days are better than others. I went back to the apartment yesterday to get my stuff." "How did that go?" "Jake was there," Rachel said, fiddling with her napkin. He tried to explain himself. Said it didn't mean anything, that he was just confused about the wedding, that Lindsay came on to him. "Did you believe him?" "For about 30 seconds, Rachel said with a bitter laugh. "Then I remembered that this had been going on for months, according to what Lindsay told me." "You don't accidentally have an affair for months?" The waitress came over and took their order. David got the cheapest pasta on the menu, and Rachel ordered the same thing. When the waitress walked away, David looked at Rachel curiously. "Did you just order that because I did?" Rachel's face turned red. "Maybe. I didn't want you to think I was some spoiled rich girl who only eats expensive food." "Rachel," David said gently, "you can order whatever you want. I'm not going to judge you for liking lobster or whatever." "I actually hate seafood," Rachel said, and they both laughed. As they waited for their food, they fell into easy conversation. Rachel told him more about her work at the community center, and David found himself fascinated by the stories she shared. She worked with kids whose families were struggling, helping them with homework and making sure they had basic things like school supplies and winter coats. "It doesn't pay much," Rachel said, "but it's the first job I've ever had where I feel like I'm actually making a difference." "Your parents must be proud," David said. Rachel made a face. "My dad thinks I'm wasting my potential. He keeps saying I could be helping a lot more people if I just joined the company and used our resources to start some kind of charity foundation. Would that be so bad?" "Maybe not," Rachel said thoughtfully. "But I like working directly with people. I like knowing their names and their stories. In a big foundation, it would all be numbers on spreadsheets." Their food arrived, and David was relieved to see the portions were huge. At least he'd get leftovers out of this. As they ate, Rachel asked him about his own family. "It's just me and my mom now," David explained. "She's been sick for the past year, cancer. The treatments are expensive, even with insurance." "I'm sorry," Rachel said. "That must be really hard." "Some days are worse than others," David said, echoing what she'd said earlier. "But she's tough. She keeps telling me not to worry about her and to focus on getting back to school." "What were you studying before you had to leave?" "Education. I want to teach elementary school." David felt a little embarrassed admitting it. "I know it's not the most exciting career, but I like kids. They're honest, you know? They don't pretend to be something they're not." "I think that's amazing," Rachel said, and she sounded like she meant it. "The world needs more good teachers." They talked through the entire meal, and David found himself forgetting about the differences in their backgrounds. Rachel was easy to talk to, funny, and genuinely interested in what he had to say. When the check came, David reached for it immediately, but Rachel's hand shot out to stop him. "Let's split it," she said. "Rachel, I asked you to dinner. I'm paying." "David, please. Let me pay half." They had a brief tug of war over the check until David finally gave in. As they split the bill, he felt both grateful and a little emasculated, though he tried not to show it. Outside the restaurant, they walked slowly toward their cars. Rachel had driven herself in what David assumed was probably the most modest car in her family's collection, a Toyota that was only a few years old. "I had a really good time tonight," Rachel said when they reached her car. "Me too," David said, and realized he meant it more than he'd expected to. "David, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Does it bother you?" "The money thing, I mean." "My family's money." David thought about it honestly. "A little," he admitted. "Not because I care about money, but because it makes me feel like we're from different planets sometimes." We're not, though, Rachel said quickly. I mean, yes, I grew up with money, but that doesn't define who I am now. The person you met in your cab that night, the person who works at the community center, that's who I really am. I believe you, David said. But your family might not see it that way. What do you mean? I mean, what happens when you introduce me to your parents? What do you think your billionaire father is going to say when he meets the guy who drives a taxi? Rachel was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing. Before David could respond, Rachel's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and sighed. It's my mom, she said. I should probably take this. David nodded and stepped back to give her privacy, but he could still hear her side of the conversation. Hi, Mom. Yes, I'm still downtown. No, I'm not at the office. I'm having dinner with a friend. What friend? His name is David. There was a long pause, and David could hear a woman's voice on the other end, though he couldn't make out the words. Mom, calm down. No, he's not after the family money. How could you possibly know that? You've never met him. Another pause, longer this time. Fine, Rachel said, sounding tired. Fine, I'll bring him to Sunday dinner. But I'm warning you right now. If you're rude to him, I'm leaving. She hung up and looked at David apologetically. My mother wants to meet you. Sunday dinner at your parents' house? David asked, feeling his stomach drop. You don't have to if you don't want to, Rachel said quickly. I know it's probably terrifying. David thought about it. The smart thing would be to run. These people lived in a different world, and he was just a taxi driver who dropped out of college. But when he looked at Rachel's face, he saw something that made him change his mind. She looked hopeful but also vulnerable, like she was putting herself out there and wasn't sure if he'd catch her. Okay, he said. Sunday dinner it is. Rachel's face lit up with a smile that made David's heart skip a beat. Really? Really? But I'm warning you, if your dad tries to run a background check on me, he's going to be very disappointed. Too late, Rachel said with a grin. He probably already started. As David drove home that night in his beat-up car, he wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. In 3 days, he was going to have dinner with one of the richest families in the city. He had a feeling it was going to be the most uncomfortable meal of his life, but for Rachel, maybe it would be worth it. Sunday arrived faster than David had hoped. He stood outside the massive iron gates of the Hartwell estate, wearing his one good suit that he'd bought for his father's funeral 2 years ago. His hands were sweating as he pressed the intercom button. David? Rachel's voice crackled through the speaker. Yeah, it's me, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The gate swung open automatically, and David drove his beat-up Honda up the long driveway. He parked next to a lineup of cars that probably cost more than most people's houses. A Mercedes, a BMW, and something that looked like it belonged in a James Bond movie. Rachel met him at the front door, looking beautiful but nervous in a simple dress. You made it, she said, giving him a quick hug. I almost turned around 3 times, David admitted. I'm glad you didn't. Rachel took his hand. Come on, let's get this over with. The inside of the house was even more impressive than David had imagined. The ceilings were so high he had to crane his neck to see them. And everything looked like it belonged in a museum. A woman who was clearly Rachel's mother appeared in the hallway. Same eyes, same smile, but wearing jewelry that probably cost more than David made in a year. You must be David, she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I'm Catherine Hartwell. Nice to meet you. Mrs. Hartwell, David said, shaking her hand gently. Please, call me Catherine. Her smile was polite but guarded, the kind of smile people use when they're being nice but haven't decided if they like you yet. Where's Dad? Rachel asked. In his study, finishing a call, Catherine said. He'll be down in a moment. They made small talk in the living room while they waited. Catherine asked David polite questions about his work and his family, but David could tell she was studying him like he was some kind of puzzle she was trying to solve. When Robert Hartwell finally appeared, David understood where Rachel got her height. The man was tall and imposing, with graying hair and the kind of presence that made you want to stand up straighter. His handshake was firm and his eyes were sharp. So you're the young man who's been spending time with my daughter, he said. Yes, sir, David replied. Rachel tells me you're a taxi driver. David felt his face flush, but he kept his voice steady. Yes, sir. I am. Temporarily, Rachel said quickly. He's saving money to go back to school, is that right? Robert's eyebrows went up slightly. What are you studying? Education, David said. I want to teach elementary school. Admirable, Robert said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but impressive. Dinner was served in a dining room that was bigger than David's entire apartment. The table could easily seat 20 people, though tonight it was just the 4 of them. David had never seen so many forks and spoons at one place setting and spent the first few minutes trying to figure out which ones to use. So, David, Catherine said as they started eating, tell us about your family. It's just me and my mom now, David said. My father passed away a couple of years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Catherine said, and she sounded genuinely sympathetic. What did your father do? He was a mechanic. Owned his own shop. David caught the quick glance that passed between Rachel's parents. He knew what they were thinking. Working-class family, no money, probably after their daughter's inheritance. And your mother? Robert asked. She's been sick, David said quietly. Cancer. The treatments are expensive, so I've been working to help with the bills. That must be difficult, Catherine said, and this time her sympathy sounded real. As the meal went on, the conversation gradually became less awkward. David found himself relaxing slightly, especially when Rachel started telling her parents about her work at the community center. When she mentioned some of the kids she worked with, David could see both Catherine and Robert's expressions soften. You know, Robert said, looking at David. Rachel tells me you want to be a teacher. That's important work. I think so, David said. Kids deserve adults who believe in them. Rachel was telling us about one of your ideas, Catherine said. Something about after-school programs? David glanced at Rachel, surprised. They'd talked about this during their dinner date, but he hadn't expected her to mention it to her parents. It's just something I've been thinking about, David said. A lot of the kids at the community center don't have anywhere safe to go after school. Their parents are working, and they end up on the streets. I thought maybe if there was a program that combined homework help with activities they actually enjoyed. Like what? Robert asked, leaning forward slightly. Sports, music, art, cooking, David said, warming to the subject. Things that keep them engaged while teaching them skills. And all supervised by teachers and counselors who care about them. That's actually a very good idea, Robert said, and he sounded surprised. After dinner, Catherine excused herself to make some phone calls, leaving David alone with Robert and Rachel. David expected this to be the moment when Rachel's father told him to stay away from his daughter. Instead, Robert poured himself a glass of wine and sat back in his chair. David, can I ask you something? Sure. What are your intentions with my daughter? David felt his mouth go dry. Sir, it's a simple question. What do you want from Rachel? David looked at Rachel, who was watching him intently. He could give the safe answer. Say they were just friends, avoid making waves. But something about the way Rachel was looking at him made him decide to tell the truth. I want to get to know her better, David said. She's smart and funny and caring, and she makes me want to be a better person. I know we come from different worlds, but I think she's amazing. And the money? Robert asked bluntly. My family's money doesn't factor into your feelings at all? David felt a flash of anger, but he kept his voice calm. Mr. Hartwell, I'm not going to pretend that your family's money doesn't exist. But the night I met Rachel, I had no idea who she was. She was just a woman who needed help, and I helped her. That's it. A woman who couldn't pay her cab fare, Robert pointed out. A woman who was having the worst night of her life, David corrected. Money was the last thing on my mind. Robert studied David for a long moment, then looked at his daughter. Rachel, honey, would you mind getting me another glass of wine from the kitchen? Rachel looked like she wanted to protest, but she got up and left the room. As soon as she was gone, Robert leaned forward. Let me be very clear with you, David, he said quietly. My daughter has been hurt before by people who saw dollar signs when they looked at her. I won't let that happen again. I understand, David said. Do you? Because if you hurt her, if you break her heart or take advantage of her in any way, I will make your life very difficult. I have resources you can't imagine. Mr. Hartwell, David said, meeting his eyes directly, I would never hurt Rachel, and if I ever did anything to make her unhappy, you wouldn't need to come after me. I'd hate myself enough for both of us. Something in Robert's expression shifted. You really care about her? Yes, sir, I do. When Rachel returned with the wine, she found her father and David talking about David's plans to return to school. The tension in the room had completely disappeared. Dad's been asking about your education goals, Rachel said, sitting back down. Actually, Robert said, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the after-school programs. Have you ever considered that something like that might be possible to implement on a larger scale? What do you mean? David asked. I mean, what if you had the resources to create not just one program, but dozens? What if you could help thousands of kids instead of just the ones at Rachel's community center? David stared at him. That would be incredible, but the funding alone would be significant, Robert agreed. But not impossible, especially if someone was passionate enough about the project to make it work. Dad, Rachel said slowly, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that maybe it's time Hartwell Tech expanded into education and community development, Robert said. And maybe we need someone who understands both the problems and the solutions to head up that division. David felt like the room was spinning. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity, Robert said. You could finish your education degree while working with us part-time, learning the business side of things. Then when you're ready, you could run the entire community development program. I don't know what to say, David said honestly. Say you'll think about it, Rachel said, taking his hand under the table. 6 months later, David was standing in front of the same iron gates where he'd been so nervous on that Sunday afternoon. But this time he wasn't visiting as Rachel's nervous boyfriend. He was coming home. The after-school program had been a huge success. They'd opened 5 centers across the city, helping over 200 kids every day. David had finished his degree and was officially the director of community development for Hartwell Tech. But more importantly, he was engaged to the woman he loved. As he walked up to the front door, David could hear laughter from the backyard. He found Rachel and her parents setting up for a barbecue, a far cry from the formal dinner they'd shared that first night. There he is, Rachel said, running over to hug him. How did the meeting go with the school board? They approved funding for 3 more centers, David said, spinning her around. That's wonderful, Catherine said, giving him a hug. I'm proud of you, son, Robert said, and David realized it was the first time he'd called him that. Later that evening, as David and Rachel sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Rachel leaned against his shoulder. Can you believe this is our life now? She asked. Sometimes I still feel like I'm dreaming, David admitted. A year ago, I was just a taxi driver trying to make ends meet. You were never just anything, Rachel said firmly. You were the man who stopped to help a stranger on the worst night of her life. You were the man who gave up a week's worth of groceries to make sure I got home safely. That's who you've always been. David thought about that rainy night that had changed everything. If he hadn't decided to stop, if he'd just driven past that bus stop like any sensible person would have, he'd still be driving his cab, struggling to pay his mother's medical bills, dreaming about a future that seemed impossible. Instead, he'd found love, purpose, and a family that had welcomed him with open arms once they saw who he really was. I love you, he said, kissing the top of Rachel's head. I love you too, she replied. My night in a yellow taxi. As they sat there together, David realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest act of kindness. All it takes is one person willing to stop and help another person in need. Everything else is just details.